Long before the name Aztec would ever be spoken, the land that would cradle their empire was already ancient. The Valley of Mexico lay high above sea level, ringed by mountains whose peaks pierced the clouds, some crowned with snow that never melted. The air was thin and clear, the light sharp, and the seasons marked not by ice and thaw, but by the great rhythms of rain and drought. In this place, lakes glistened like mirrors, and the largest, Lake Texcoco, stretched broad and shallow, its waters shimmering under the sun. The land was fertile where the soil was moist, yet beyond the wetlands lay arid stretches, home to thorny shrubs and the occasional grove of hardy trees. The climate was harsh enough to demand ingenuity, yet generous enough to reward it richly. For thousands of years, people had lived here. Long before the Aztecs, the Olmecs had carved their colossal heads and left behind the seeds of complex religion. Later came the Teotihuacanos, who built a city so vast that it dwarfed anything in the Americas at the time. Along the Avenue of the Dead, their pyramids still rose even in the Aztec age, though no one alive remembered the names of the kings who built them. The Toltecs followed, famed for their warriors and artisanship. Their capital, Tula, became a model of urban order and military discipline, and in Aztec eyes, a golden age to be emulated. By the time the Aztec forebears appeared on the horizon, this valley was already a mosaic of city-states, each ruled by a tlatoani, or speaker, whose voice commanded armies and oversaw markets. The land was alive with rivalries and alliances, with merchants carrying cacao, cotton, and obsidian along the causeways. Farmers worked terraced fields, priests tended temple fires, and warriors trained in the arts of both combat and ceremony. Yet despite the richness of the valley, it was not a place where newcomers were easily welcomed. Every inch of arable land was claimed, every waterway defended. Any tribe seeking a home here would need cunning as well as strength, and in time, the wandering people who would call themselves Mexico would prove they possessed both. They would come carrying a story, a legend of a distant homeland called Aztlan, and a promise from their god, Huitzilopochtli, that they would find the place where an eagle perched upon a cactus devouring a serpent. There they would build their city, and there they would rise to greatness. In the centuries to come, this valley would witness that promise fulfilled and shattered. But in these early days, the land simply waited, holding in its lakes and hills the seeds of the empire to come. The people who would one day be known as the Aztecs did not begin their story in the Valley of Mexico. Their roots, shrouded in a haze of myth and memory, reached back to a place they called Aztlan, the place of herons, a land of shimmering waters and fertile shores. Whether it was a real homeland far to the north or a symbolic paradise of origin, no one in later times could say for certain. For the Mexica, it was both a memory carried in song and a compass guiding their destiny. According to the stories told by their elders, Aztlan was ruled by a wise leader under the protection of Huitzilopochtli, their tribal god. But a time came when the god commanded them to leave. They were to wander the earth until they found the sign he promised, an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a serpent. There, and only there, they would build the city destined to be the heart of their empire. And so they left, carrying their gods in sacred bundles, the elders chanting, the warriors guarding the front and rear of the migration. It was not a single march, but a long journey that unfolded across years, even generations. They moved through deserts where the sun scoured the land by day and the cold bit deep at night. They crossed rivers swollen by rains, skirted hostile territories, and passed through lands already claimed by powerful city-states. At times they lingered in a place for years, sowing crops and raising children, only to be driven on by famine, war, or the voice of their God commanding them forward. Their migration was not without division. Along the way, groups splintered off, some tired of wandering, others unwilling to endure Huitzilopochtli's demands. These departures were remembered in legend as moments of sorrow, for each loss weakened the traveling band. Yet those who remained bound themselves ever tighter to their God and his promise. In the Valley of Mexico, their arrival was far from triumphant. To the established city-states, they were little more than ragged outsiders, a wandering tribe with no fixed home, seeking land in a place where every field was already claimed. The Mexica offered their services as mercenaries, lending their courage and skill in battle to whichever ruler would grant them shelter. In this way, they learned the ways of the valley's politics and war, observing the strengths and weaknesses of its lords. For a time, they settled near the city of Culhuacan, a powerful Altepetl whose rulers claimed Toltec heritage. Here the Mexica gained favor, even marrying into noble families. Yet this alliance ended in blood. According to the chronicles, a marriage arrangement turned into sacrilege when the Mexica sacrificed a Culhuacan princess to Huitzilopochtli, skinning her to clothe a priest in her remains as part of a sacred ritual. What was divine to the Mexica was an unspeakable insult to Culhuacan. The enraged ruler drove them out, forcing them once more into the marshy fringes of the valley. It was in these inhospitable wetlands, surrounded by reeds and shallow waters, that they finally saw the promised sign. Upon a small island in Lake Texcoco, an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, clutching a serpent in its beak. To the Mexica, this was no mere coincidence. This was the fulfillment of prophecy, the command of their God made flesh before their eyes. There, on that island, they began to build. It was nothing at first, a scattering of reed huts on muddy ground. But the Mexica were no strangers to hardship. The same resilience that had carried them from Aztlan through years of wandering would now anchor them to this place. They called their new home Tenochtitlan, the place of the stone cactus. What they began as an act of faith would, in the space of a few generations, become one of the most remarkable cities the world had ever seen. The island on Lake Texcoco was little more than a patch of marsh and mud when the Mexica first claimed it. The waters around it were brackish, the ground soft and treacherous. To many, it seemed a place unfit for human dwelling. Yet for the Mexica, hardened by years of wandering and guided by their God's command, it was a sanctuary. Here they could be free from the domination of stronger neighbors. Here they could root themselves in the land. Their first shelters were built from reeds lashed together, their floors raised above the damp earth. The people fished in the lake, hunted birds, and gathered the edible plants that grew along its shallows. But subsistence was not enough. They dreamed of building a city worthy of the gods, and of their own ambition. The greatest challenge was the land itself. To grow food, they turned to an innovation that would become one of their defining achievements, the chinampa. These were floating gardens, built by driving stakes into the lake bed, weaving reed mats between them, and piling mud and organic matter until solid ground rose above the water. Over time, these fertile plots supported maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers. Canals between the chinampas became watery streets, navigated by canoes. In this way, they expanded their usable land without ever leaving the lake. The city began to take shape in an orderly fashion, its streets laid out with care. Causeways of stone and earth linked the island to the mainland, each equipped with removable bridges that could be pulled up in times of war. Fresh water, essential for the growing population, was brought from the springs of Chapultepec via aqueducts that crossed the lake. The Mexica did not merely survive in their watery home, they transformed it into an advantage. At the city's heart, they raised the first version of the Templo Maya, the great temple dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. It was a double pyramid, each side crowned with a shrine to its respective deity. Here the cycles of war and sustenance, conquest and agriculture, met in sacred balance. From this temple, priests could look out over the growing city, its waterways gleaming in the sun. Tenochtitlan was not an isolated wonder. The Mexica maintained a wary relationship with neighboring powers, alternately serving them in war and resisting their domination. They traded across the valley, bringing in obsidian, cacao, cotton, and exotic feathers, and sending out their own goods, fish, lake salt, and finely crafted objects. Even in its youth, the city had an energy that set it apart. Its people carried themselves with the confidence of those who believed they were destined for greatness. Over time, the population swelled. The island expanded through more chinampas, its skyline marked by new temples and palaces. Nobles' houses of stone and plaster stood beside bustling markets where merchants from across Mesoamerica mingled. The sound of drums and conch shells echoed across the water, calling the faithful to ceremonies that blended awe with terror, for the gods demanded offerings, and the Mexica believed that the sun itself depended on their willingness to give. From humble huts on marshland, Tenochtitlan had begun its transformation into the jewel of the Valley of Mexico. The waters that had once seemed a barrier were now its lifeblood, binding its people together in a city unlike any other. And in the heart of the Mexica, there was no doubt, this was the place their God had promised, and it would stand at the center of an empire. As Tenochtitlan grew from a settlement of exiles into a city of promise, it required leaders capable of guiding its fortunes. The Mexica chose their rulers not only for noble blood but for proven skill in war, diplomacy, and devotion to the gods. The first to bear the title of Tlatoani, he who speaks, was Acamapictli. His reign would lay the foundation upon which the Aztec Empire would rise. Acamapictli was a man of mixed heritage, born of a Mexica father and a noblewoman from Culhuacan. This connection to the prestigious Toltec lineage strengthened his legitimacy in the eyes of other city-states. Under his guidance, Tenochtitlan began its transformation from a precarious island community into a formidable political force. He organized the building of more chinampas, improved the city's defenses, and established laws that defined the responsibilities and privileges of nobles, warriors, priests, and commoners. Law in Tenochtitlan was not a matter of abstract principle but of divine order. The Tlatoani ruled as the chosen representative of the gods, his authority sanctioned by the sacred rituals of the Templo Maya. Crimes were judged with severity, for wrongdoing was not only an offense against society but a disruption of the cosmic balance. Theft, adultery, or drunkenness among the nobility could result in execution. Justice was swift, and the fear of divine displeasure kept many in line. Akamapikli's reign also marked the beginning of Tenochtitlan's military expansion. The Mexica offered their warriors as allies to stronger powers, gaining both battlefield experience and political leverage. Victories brought spoils, captives for sacrifice, and growing prestige. With each campaign, the Mexica earned a reputation for discipline and ferocity. When Akamapikli died, his successors continued the work he began. Huitzilopochtli, the second Tlatoani, strengthened alliances through marriage and trade, fostering ties with neighboring city-states. Under his rule, Tenochtitlan began to dress itself in the trappings of a rising capital, larger temples, markets stocked with goods from distant lands, and an increasingly complex social order. It was during these early generations that the Mexica refined the codes of power that would define their empire. At the top stood the Huitzilopochtli, the great speaker, whose word was law. Beneath him, the nobility served as generals, judges, and provincial governors. Priests guarded the sacred rituals and interpreted the will of the gods. Commoners worked the fields and served in the army, their service rewarded with land and a share of the spoils from war. Tenochtitlan was still young, yet its rulers understood that survival in the Valley of Mexico demanded more than strength of arms. It required political cunning, the weaving of alliances, and a clear vision of destiny. These early Tlatoc, the rulers, gave the city that vision, anchoring it in tradition while setting their eyes on future conquest. And soon, that ambition would take form in a union that would change the balance of power in the valley forever. The Valley of Mexico was a land of many rivals, each city-state, or altepetl, guarding its autonomy with stubborn pride. For decades, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan had risen cautiously, building their strength under the shadow of the Tepanec Empire, whose capital, Azcapotzalco, dominated the region through tribute and intimidation. The Tepanec ruler, Maxtla, was a man feared for his ruthlessness, yet despised for his arrogance. His reign would ignite the conflict that forged the greatest political alliance in Mesoamerican history. The Mexica were once subjects of the Tepanecs, paying tribute and serving as mercenaries in their wars. This arrangement, though burdensome, had allowed Tenochtitlan to grow in wealth and military skill. But as Maxtla's grip tightened, tensions flared. The breaking point came when Nezahualcóyotl, the rightful ruler of Texcoco and a poet-warrior of great renown, sought refuge in Tenochtitlan after being driven from his city by Tepanec forces. The Mexica, bound by shared grievances, offered him protection. In doing so, they drew the wrath of Maxtla upon themselves. War erupted, a war not of quick raids but of prolonged siege and strategy. Tenochtitlan could not stand alone against Azcapotzalco's might. It needed allies. The exiled Nezahualcóyotl brought Texcoco's warriors into the cause, while Tlacopan, another Tepanec city-state resentful of Maxtla's tyranny, joined the coalition. Together, these three powers formed a pact that would come to be known as the Triple Alliance. The alliance was not born of trust or friendship, but of necessity and mutual advantage. The agreement was clear: when victory came, the spoils of war and the tribute of conquered cities would be divided, 2/5 to Tenochtitlan, 2/5 to Texcoco, and 1/5 to Tlacopan. This balance ensured cooperation while recognizing Tenochtitlan's growing dominance. The campaign against Azcapotzalco was fierce. The Allied forces cut supply lines, launched coordinated assaults, and pressed the Tepanecs from multiple fronts. Finally, in a decisive battle, the Tepanec capital fell. Maxtla was captured and executed, his empire dismantled. The victors stood as the new arbiters of power in the valley. From this moment, the Triple Alliance became more than a military compact. It was the political backbone of an empire. Each member retained autonomy, yet acted in concert when waging war or demanding tribute. Tenochtitlan emerged as the senior partner, its warriors the most feared, its markets the most vibrant, and its temples the most splendid. Texcoco contributed not only soldiers but a tradition of learning and governance, with Nezahualcoyotl's court becoming a center of law, architecture, and poetry. Tlacopan, though smaller, played a vital role in maintaining the alliance's military and economic network. With the Tepanecs destroyed, the Triple Alliance turned outward. Neighboring city-states were drawn into the web of conquest, some through diplomacy, others through the iron edge of the Macuahuitl, the obsidian-bladed sword of the Mexica. Each victory brought new tributary provinces, swelling the coffers of the alliance and feeding the grandeur of its capitals. In the streets of Tenochtitlan, the change was visible. Tribute from conquered lands filled the markets with goods once rare: jade from the south, cacao from the warm coastal plains, tropical bird feathers that shimmered in the sun, and textiles so fine they seemed woven from air. Processions of warriors returned from campaigns, leading captives destined for the sacrificial altars, their fate sealed in service to the sun. The Triple Alliance had transformed the political map of central Mexico. What began as a desperate coalition against a common enemy had become the foundation of an empire. And at its heart, Tenochtitlan pulsed with new energy, the unshakable confidence of a city that had tasted power and found it to its liking. The Mexica would not be content to rule the valley alone. Their gaze now turned beyond the lakes and mountains, toward lands yet unconquered. In the Mexica world, war was not merely a matter of survival or expansion, it was the sacred duty of a people chosen by the gods. Every battle, every campaign, every captive taken was part of a cosmic struggle to keep the sun in its eternal journey across the sky. Without the nourishment of human blood, the Mexica believed, the sun would falter, and the world itself would end. From youth, boys were prepared for this destiny. At the Telpoch-Cali, the house of the young, they trained in running, swimming, weapon use, and discipline. Nobles, destined for leadership, attended the Carmichac, where they studied not only war but history, religion, and the arts of command. Strength of body was matched with strength of will. Cowardice was a disgrace that stained not only the warrior but his family. The Mexica army was a disciplined force, organized into units based on neighborhoods and warrior societies. Among these, the most prestigious were the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors. To earn a place in their ranks, a man had to capture, not kill, enemies in battle, bringing them back alive for sacrifice. The taking of captives was the true measure of valor, for each captive was an offering to the gods. Weapons were crafted with care and deadly efficiency. The macua huital, a wooden club edged with sharp obsidian blades, could fell an enemy with a single blow. The atlatl, a spear thrower, gave warriors the reach to strike from a distance. Shields were decorated with feathers and painted symbols, not merely for defense but to declare the warrior's achievements and status. The Mexica waged war in different ways. There were wars of conquest, designed to subjugate new lands and bring them into the tribute system. There were punitive wars, meant to punish rebellion and remind subject cities of their place. And then there were the flower wars, ritualized conflicts arranged between rival powers, fought not to seize territory but to take captives for sacrifice. These battles were as much religious ceremonies as military engagements, reinforcing the shared belief that human blood was the sustenance of the gods. Discipline in the field was strict. Orders from commanders were to be followed without hesitation. Desertion or disobedience was punishable by death. Yet the rewards for bravery were rich: promotions, land grants, the right to wear elaborate garments, and seats at the banquets of the elite. The highest honor was to die in battle, for such warriors were believed to accompany the sun in its rising, returning to the world as hummingbirds and butterflies. Victories brought more than glory. They fed the economic engine of the empire. Conquered cities were bound to send tribute: maize, beans, cotton, salt, cacao, gold, and labor, enriching Tenochtitlan and its allies. Tribute lists recorded in codices show a steady stream of goods flowing into the capital, a visible measure of the Mexica's reach. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the spoils of war transformed the city's appearance. Temples rose higher, palaces grew grander, markets swelled with goods from distant lands. Warriors paraded in their finest regalia, their headdresses blazing with the colors of the tropics, each feather a token of triumph. But behind this splendor lay an unending cycle. The more the empire expanded, the more it required fresh tribute and captives to sustain both its economy and its rituals. War was not an occasional necessity, it was the very rhythm of the empire's heartbeat. And as the Mexica gaze turned ever outward, the map of Mesoamerica began to shift under the shadow of their obsidian blades. To understand the Mexica, one must first understand their gods. The Aztec world was alive with divine presence, in the mountains, the rivers, the sun and moon, in the very heartbeat of the people. Yet above all stood the gods of the great temple, Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, whose domains of war and rain represented the balance between destruction and life-giving abundance. Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, was the tribal god of the Mexica, the one who had led them from Aztlan to the promised island in Lake Texcoco. He was the sun in his warrior aspect, the embodiment of victory. To him was owed the blood of captives, for only with such offerings could he continue his daily struggle against the darkness. His shrine atop the Templo Maya blazed with banners and was approached by steep stone steps, each one a reminder of the ascent toward the divine. Beside him in sacred partnership was Tlaloc, the rain-bringer, the master of water and fertility. Without his blessings, crops would wither and the people would starve. His temple stood side by side with Huitzilopochtli's, for in Mexica thought, the sun's fire and the rain's life-giving waters were both essential to the survival of the world. One could not exist without the other. But these two were not alone. The Mexica pantheon was vast and intricate. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was a god of wind, learning, and renewal, revered not only by the Mexica but by many peoples before them. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was a force of fate, war, and sorcery, unpredictable and often cruel. Zyptotec, our lord the flayed one, was the god of spring and renewal, his rituals symbolizing the shedding of old skin for new life. Each god had his or her festivals, colors, symbols, and priesthood. The bond between humans and gods was sustained through ritual, and at the center of this ritual was sacrifice. To the Mexica, sacrifice was not cruelty for its own sake but the highest act of devotion. The gods had given their own essence to create the world. In return, humans were bound to nourish them with life force, tonali, carried in the blood and hearts of living beings. The most precious offering was the heart of a warrior taken in battle, for it carried the vigor and courage the gods themselves valued. The Templo Maya was the stage upon which this covenant was enacted. On the appointed days, captives were led up its steep steps, painted and adorned according to the god to whom they would be offered. Priests, robed in black or white and crowned with elaborate headdresses, carried obsidian knives polished to a razor's edge. The victim was laid upon the Quetzalcoatl, the sacrificial stone, his chest opened in a single practice motion. The heart was raised toward the sky, a gift to the sun, before being placed in a sacred vessel. The body was cast down the temple steps, its journey symbolic of the sun's descent into the underworld. Not all sacrifices were of war captives. Children were offered to Tlaloc during times of drought, their tears believed to summon the rains. In other ceremonies, warriors volunteered to impersonate a god for a year, living in luxury before willingly meeting their fate, their death sealing the sacred cycle. There were offerings of animals, of food, of precious objects, but it was human blood that was considered the most potent nourishment. These rituals were not hidden from the people. They were public acts, witnessed by crowds in the plaza below. For the Mexica, to see and participate in these rites was to affirm their place in the cosmic order. The sight of blood flowing down the temple steps was a reminder of the fragility of the world, held together by the courage of warriors and the devotion of the people. The calendar was filled with festivals, each tied to the cycles of agriculture, the movements of the heavens, and the myths of the gods. There were dances, feasts, and elaborate dramas reenacting the divine stories. Music of drums, flutes, and conch shells filled the air, mingling with the scent of copal incense rising toward the sky. It was in these moments that the Mexica felt themselves most united, as a people bound together under the gaze of the gods, sustaining creation through their faith and their willingness to give. Yet beneath the pageantry lay an unyielding truth: the empire's power was inseparable from its religion. Conquest fed the temples with captives, and the temples, in turn, justified conquest. War and worship were threads in the same tapestry, woven so tightly that neither could be removed without unmaking the whole. In the shadow of the Templo Maya, the Mexica lived with the certainty that their empire existed not for their own glory alone, but to keep the sun alive and the world from slipping into darkness. Tenochtitlan, at the height of its glory, was more than a political capital. It was a living organism, pulsing with the rhythms of trade, ritual, labor, and leisure. Built upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, it dazzled travelers with its harmony of nature and human design. Causeways stretched across the lake, their stone surfaces wide enough for armies to march upon. Canoes glided silently along canals lined with flowers and the bright painted walls of homes. From the center, the white bulk of the Templo Mayor rose above the city like a mountain of stone. The city's districts, or calpulli, were more than mere neighborhoods, they were the building blocks of Mexican society. Each calpulli was a community in itself, with its own temple, schools, workshops, and farmland. Members worked together to maintain canals, plant chinampas, and fulfill the tribute obligations demanded by the state. In return, they received protection and access to shared resources. Life in the calpulli fostered loyalty, not only to the empire, but to one's own kin and neighbors. The streets and waterways of Tenochtitlan bustled with activity from dawn until dusk. Merchants and craftsmen displayed their goods in small markets scattered throughout the city, but the true heart of commerce lay to the north, in Tlatelolco. This great market, larger than many cities, drew thousands of buyers and sellers each day. Here, traders from distant lands offered cacao beans from Chiapas, salt from coastal plains, gold dust from Oaxaca, and brilliantly colored quetzal feathers from the tropical forests. Farmers brought maize, beans, squash, chilies, and fresh fish caught from the lake. Artisans displayed obsidian blades sharp enough to slice hair, cotton garments woven with intricate designs, and pottery painted with symbolic patterns. The market was carefully regulated. Officials oversaw transactions, measured goods, and resolved disputes. Certain items, such as jade or fine cloaks, could only be purchased by nobles or warriors of high rank. Cacao beans served as currency, as did lengths of cotton cloth, each with a recognized value. This careful order ensured that the market's energy did not descend into chaos, even with the vast crowds it attracted. Homes varied in size and splendor according to status. Commoners lived in modest one-story dwellings of adobe or reed, their walls whitewashed and their roofs thatched. Nobles resided in multi-room houses built of stone, with courtyards, gardens, and plastered floors. The emperor's palace was a city within the city, an immense complex of halls, gardens, aviaries, and storehouses. Visitors described its splendor with awe, rooms hung with fine cloth, pools stocked with fish, and corridors where tame birds walked freely. Life followed the rhythms of labor and celebration. Men tended the chinampas, worked in the city's building projects, or served in the army. Women ground maize on stone methods, wove cloth, raised children, and managed the household. Gender roles were distinct but equally valued. A woman who died in childbirth was honored as highly as a warrior who fell in battle, for both had given life for the continuation of the people. Religion was woven into the daily routine. Small household shrines honored local gods and ancestors, while larger ceremonies drew the entire calpulli or city together. The year was marked by a sequence of festivals, each bringing music, dancing, and the scent of copal incense drifting through the air. Even mundane tasks carried sacred weight. Planting seeds, weaving cloth, or fishing from a canoe could be acts of devotion when performed with the proper rituals. Education was universal, though shaped by class. Every child learned the history, songs, and moral codes of the Mexica. Boys trained for war or specialized trades, girls learned household skills, weaving, and religious duties. Nobles received more advanced instruction in leadership, law, and priestly knowledge, preparing them to guide the empire. What struck foreign visitors most was the city's cleanliness and order. Workers swept the streets, and waste was collected daily in canoes to be used as fertilizer. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mainland, while a system of dikes controlled the lake's salinity. In an age when many cities in the world struggled with filth and disease, Tenochtitlan's planning stood as a marvel. Yet beneath this beauty and order lay the discipline of an empire built on tribute and war. The goods that filled the markets, the stone that raised the temples, and the flowers that adorned the canals all flowed from lands conquered or bound by obligation. Tenochtitlan's splendor was sustained by the steady flow of resources from beyond its shores, a flow that could never be allowed to falter. For its people, life in the city was a blend of privilege and duty. To walk its streets was to feel the power of the empire in every stone and canal. And to live here was to share in the destiny that had begun on a humble island, under the gaze of an eagle and a cactus, and now shone across the valley of Mexico like the sun itself. The Mexica believed that wisdom was as vital to the empire's survival as courage in battle. While warriors brought tribute and captives, scholars, priests, and teachers preserved the laws, histories, and rituals that held society together. Knowledge was not a privilege of the few, it was a duty, instilled from childhood and nurtured throughout life. Education began in the home. From the earliest years, children were taught respect for their elders, discipline in work, and obedience to the gods. Stories of the Mexica's journey from Aztlan, the deeds of great rulers, and the sacred myths of the pantheon were told at night, their lessons woven into the fabric of daily life. Mothers instructed daughters in weaving, cooking, and household management, fathers taught sons the basics of farming, fishing, or the handling of weapons. Formal schooling was universal, though divided by class. Commoners attended the Telpoch-Cali, the house of the young, where boys learned endurance through physical labor, military skills, and public service. They carried firewood, repaired roads and canals, and drilled in the use of spears, shields, and the macuahuitl. Girls were trained in domestic arts, midwifery, and the rituals that marked the passage of life from birth to death. The children of nobles attended the Kamikak, a more demanding institution dedicated to training the future leaders, priests, and high-ranking officers of the empire. Here, discipline was even stricter. Students rose before dawn to sweep the temple courts, fetch water, and tend the sacred fires. They memorized long passages of hymns, prayers, and orations, learning to speak with the precision and dignity required of a ruler. They studied astronomy, reading the movements of the sun, moon, and stars to guide agriculture and ritual. They learned the intricate workings of the Tonalpohualli and Zupohualli, the sacred and solar calendars whose interlocking cycles governed the rhythm of the year. Writing, for the Mexica, was a sacred craft. Scribes, known as tlaquilos, painted codices on deerskin or bark paper, their pages filled with pictographic symbols and bright colors. These codices recorded tribute lists, genealogies, historical events, and religious knowledge. They were both archives and works of art, meant to be read aloud by those trained to interpret their images. In the Karmikak, students learn to read and create such codices, preserving the memory of their people for future generations. Medicine, too, was a respected discipline. Healers combined practical knowledge of herbs, minerals, and surgery with spiritual practices meant to restore the harmony between body and soul. The empire's physicians treated wounds from the battlefield, fevers, and ailments of the spirit alike. Certain plants, like cacao and maguey, served both as sustenance and as remedies, while obsidian blades were used in precise surgical procedures. Philosophy in the Mexico world was inseparable from religion. Wise men, known as tlamatanaim, pondered the nature of life, death, and the fate of the soul. Their teachings, preserved in songs and poems, spoke of the world as a fragile place, on the slippery earth, where nothing was permanent but the name and the flower, honor and beauty. They urged balance between the pleasures of life and the duties owed to the gods and the community. Astronomy held a place of high importance. Priests observed the skies from temple platforms, marking solstices, equinoxes, and eclipses. The timing of planting, harvesting, and festivals depended on their calculations. The great calendars were more than tools, they were the heartbeat of the cosmos, ensuring that human actions were aligned with the divine order. Through this system, the Mexica ensured that each generation was prepared to serve the empire in body and mind. Warriors, artisans, priests, and rulers all drew from the same well of shared knowledge. The city's strength lay not only in its armies and wealth, but in its understanding of the cycles of nature, the will of the gods, and the history of its own rise. In Tenochtitlan, to be ignorant was to be incomplete, for knowledge was a weapon as sharp as any obsidian blade, and wisdom the surest shield against the chaos that lay beyond the empire's reach. In the Mexico world, art was not created merely for beauty's sake. It was a language, a way to speak to the gods, to record history, and to proclaim the power of the empire. Every line, every color, every form carried meaning. To walk through Tenochtitlan was to move through a living gallery of symbols, each one a thread in the tapestry of Mexican identity. The architecture of the city spoke first. At its heart, the Templo Maya rose like a sacred mountain, its twin staircases leading to the shrines of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. The pyramid's alignment with the sun's position during the equinox tied the city itself to the rhythms of the cosmos. Around it stood smaller temples, palaces, and ceremonial platforms, each adorned with reliefs and sculptures depicting gods, warriors, and mythical beasts. Stone was the favored medium for public art. Sculptors carved monumental statues of deities, Tlaloc with his goggle eyes and fanged mouth, Coatlicue with her skirt of serpents and necklace of hearts and skulls. These images were not decorative, they were embodiments of the divine, their very presence lending power to the spaces they inhabited. To touch or stand before them was to be in the presence of the god they represented. Color was everywhere. Walls were painted in reds, blues, yellows, and greens, drawn from minerals, plants, and insects. Blue-green tones, associated with jade and precious feathers, were reserved for the most sacred contexts. Artists painted murals showing scenes from myth, history, and daily life, battles, ceremonies, processions, blending the earthly and the supernatural in a single frame. Featherwork was among the highest arts of the Mexica. Skilled artisans known as Amanteca created cloaks, headdresses, and shields from the iridescent plumes of tropical birds. These works shimmered like living rainbows, their patterns forming images of gods, eagles, or abstract designs. The most exquisite feather mosaics were offerings to the gods or diplomatic gifts to other rulers, their beauty unmatched by any other material. Jewelry and ornamentation were equally rich in symbolism. Gold, though valued, was less sacred than jade, turquoise, and obsidian, each of which carried specific spiritual meanings. Jade symbolized life and fertility, turquoise was linked to fire and the sun, obsidian, sharp and black, was associated with war and the night. These materials were shaped into necklaces, earspools, nose ornaments, and pectorals, worn by nobles, priests, and warriors according to their rank and achievements. Textiles, too, told stories. Cotton garments were woven with intricate patterns that indicated a wearer's status and accomplishments. Certain designs were reserved for those who had captured multiple enemies in battle, others marked the office of a priest or ruler. Clothing was not merely personal adornment, it was a public declaration of one's place in the social and cosmic order. The Mexica also mastered the art of symbolism in their codices. Painted by tlaquilos, these pictorial manuscripts used images to record events, genealogies, tribute lists, and religious cycles. They were portable histories, meant to be read aloud, each symbol rich with layers of meaning. A simple glyph might stand for a place, a person, or an entire event, depending on its context. Even the city's gardens and landscapes were works of art. The emperor's pleasure gardens contained rare plants and animals from across the empire, arranged in ways that reflected the Mexica understanding of harmony between the natural and divine worlds. In these spaces, stone sculptures stood among flowering trees, and pools mirrored the sky. In the Mexica view, art and symbols were acts of power. They bound the present to the past, the human to the divine. They reminded the people of who they were, where they had come from, and the destiny their gods had promised them. Whether etched into stone, painted on plaster, or woven into cloth, these images were more than decoration, they were the living memory of the empire, as enduring as the mountains that ringed the Valley of Mexico. When Montezuma I, known as Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, ascended the throne of Tenochtitlan in the mid-15th century, the city was already the dominant power in the Valley of Mexico. Yet in his vision, the Mexica were destined for more than regional supremacy. The empire's borders, he believed, should stretch far beyond the surrounding lakes and mountains, binding distant peoples into a single tribute network under the rule of the Triple Alliance. Moctezuma I was both a warrior and a statesman. His name, he who frowns like a lord, reflected the gravity with which he approached his duties. Tall, dignified, and known for his stern sense of justice, he inspired both respect and fear. From the moment of his coronation, he sought to consolidate the empire's foundations and expand its reach. One of his first acts was to reform the tribute system. Under his rule, conquered provinces were organized into efficient administrative units, each responsible for sending goods to Tenochtitlan at regular intervals. Tribute lists grew longer and more diverse, cacao from the warm coastal plains, cotton garments from the valleys, maize, and beans from fertile fields, salt and fish from the lakes, gold dust, jade, and precious feathers from far-off lands. These goods enriched not only the nobility but the temples, markets, and public works of the city. Expansion came swiftly. Montezuma I led campaigns against rebellious provinces, ensuring that no city within the empire could challenge the authority of the Triple Alliance. He pushed the frontiers south into the fertile lands of the Mixtecs and Zapotecs, east toward the Gulf Coast, and west into the rugged highlands. Each victory brought new tributary states, swelling the empire's coffers and its prestige. Yet conquest was not without its challenges. Distant provinces often resisted Mexico rule, and maintaining control required both military presence and political manipulation. Montezuma relied on a network of governors, tax collectors, and loyal local rulers to keep the tribute flowing. Those who defied him faced swift retribution, their cities sacked, their leaders executed, their people taken as slaves or captives for sacrifice. Moctezuma I also turned his attention to the welfare of Tenochtitlan itself. During his reign, the city suffered a catastrophic flood when torrential rains caused Lake Texcoco to rise and overwhelm the causeways. In response, he ordered the construction of a massive dike, designed by the engineer Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco, to regulate the lake's waters. This monumental project not only protected the city from future floods but became a testament to the empire's engineering skill. Under Montezuma's rule, the Templo Mayor was expanded to reflect the growing might of the empire. Its terraces rose higher, its staircases widened, and its shrines adorned with ever more elaborate offerings. Festivals grew more lavish, their sacrifices drawing captives from across the empire, a public display of the Mexica's dominance and the gods' favor. Diplomacy and intimidation worked hand in hand. Moctezuma skillfully balanced relations with allied and subject states, using marriage alliances, trade privileges, and threats of war to keep the empire's structure intact. His reign marked a period of stability within the Triple Alliance, with Tenochtitlan as its undisputed leader. By the time Montezuma I's reign ended, the Mexica world had been transformed. The empire stretched from coast to coast, its tribute system feeding the wealth and splendor of Tenochtitlan. Markets overflowed with goods from lands hundreds of miles away, the city's streets echoed with languages from dozens of different peoples. For the Mexica, this expansion was not merely a political or economic achievement, it was a fulfillment of their divine destiny, the unfolding of the prophecy that had begun in the journey from Aztlan. Yet with greater size came greater demands. The machine of empire required constant fuel, more goods, more captives, more lands to conquer. In the generations to come, the Mexica would continue this path, reaching the height of their power, and, unknowingly, drawing closer to the moment when their might would be tested as never before. The reign of Ahuetzotl, the eighth Huitlatóani of Tenochtitlan, marked the zenith of the Mexica Empire's territorial expansion. Tall, imposing, and relentless in war, he was a ruler whose very name, Water Dog, suggested tenacity and ferocity. Under his command, the reach of the Triple Alliance extended farther than ever before, encompassing lands and peoples stretching from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico. Ahuetzotl came to power at a time when the empire was already vast, yet its borders remained contested. Some provinces paid tribute reluctantly, Others openly rebelled, and beyond them lay wealthy lands not yet brought under Mexican control. For Ahuetzotl, these challenges were opportunities. His reign would be defined by near-constant campaigns, each one adding new territories to the tribute network. From the beginning, he demonstrated an unyielding commitment to expansion. His armies marched south into the humid lowlands of present-day Guatemala, clashing with the formidable warriors of the Mixtecs and Zapotecs. They advanced eastward into the coastal plains, seizing control of the rich cacao-producing regions. To the west, the empire's banners were carried over rugged mountains to subdue distant highland towns. Each victory was celebrated in Tenochtitlan with triumphal processions, the streets filled with prisoners destined for the sacrificial altars. The wealth that flowed into the capital during Ahuetzotl's reign was unprecedented. Tribute lists from this period record vast quantities of cacao, cotton, maize, salt, tropical bird feathers, jaguar pelts, gold, jade, and obsidian. Skilled artisans transformed these raw materials into garments, jewelry, and ceremonial objects of breathtaking beauty, further enhancing the splendor of the city. Markets overflowed with goods from lands hundreds of miles away, and foreign merchants marveled at the abundance. Ahuetzotl also undertook ambitious building projects to match the empire's growing prestige. The Templo Mayor was expanded yet again, its tiers rising higher, its stairways widened to accommodate the immense crowds that gathered during festivals. On the day of its rededication, the city witnessed one of the largest sacrificial ceremonies in its history. Chroniclers speak of thousands of captives offered to the gods over the course of several days, a display intended to affirm the empire's divine favor and intimidate any who might challenge its authority. Infrastructure improvements accompanied these religious and military triumphs. New aqueducts brought fresh water to the city, replacing older systems and reducing the risk of drought. Causeways were reinforced and extended, and the network of roads connecting Tenochtitlan to its provinces was improved to speed the movement of armies, tribute, and messengers. The empire's reach was not only physical but administrative, binding far-off lands to the capital through efficient communication and control. Yet Ahuetzotl's ambition was not without cost. The campaigns into tropical lowlands exposed his soldiers to unfamiliar diseases and harsh climates, leading to heavy losses. The constant demands of war placed enormous strain on subject peoples, fueling resentment that would smolder long after his victories. Rebellions, though swiftly crushed, became more frequent, hinting at the limits of imperial control. Even within Tenochtitlan, there were signs of the pressures that came with greatness. The city's population swelled beyond its original capacity, forcing further expansion of chinampas and the importation of more food from tributary provinces. The growing inequality between the nobility, enriched by tribute, and the commoners, burdened by labor and military service, deepened social divisions. Despite these challenges, Ahuetzotl's reign was remembered as a golden age of power and conquest. By the time of his death, the Mexica Empire was at its largest extent, a sprawling network of lands, peoples, and resources bound together by force, fear, and the promise of shared glory under the gods. The eagle perched on the cactus had spread its wings over a vast domain, casting a shadow across Mesoamerica. But shadows, as the Mexican knew well, grow longest before nightfall. Beyond the horizon, forces unlike any the Mexica had faced before were stirring, and the reigns that followed would bring the empire not further glory, but the first signs of its undoing. The coronation of Montezuma Xocoyotzin, known to history as Montezuma II, marked a new chapter in the story of the Mexica Empire. Where his predecessor, Ahuetzotl, had been a tireless conqueror, Montezuma combined the qualities of a warrior with those of a deeply devout priest. His reign would begin in splendor and authority, but end in confusion and tragedy, as forces from across the ocean brought the ancient order of Mesoamerica to the brink. Montezuma II was a man of noble bearing, educated in the Kamicac in the arts of governance, law, astronomy, and ritual. He was known for his strict adherence to ceremonial propriety, a ruler who saw himself as the living embodiment of the god's will. His court became more formal than any before, filled with elaborate protocol. Few were allowed to look directly into his eyes. Those who approached him did so barefoot and with lowered gaze, speaking only when permitted. For the Mexica elite, this heightened formality reflected the empire's grandeur. For the common people, it set their ruler apart as a figure almost divine. Early in his reign, Montezuma continued the tradition of military campaigns, consolidating the gains of Ahuetzotl's conquests. He subdued rebellious provinces, ensured the steady flow of tribute, and extended the empire's influence in distant regions. Yet his focus was not solely on war. He strengthened the tribute system, reorganized the administration of the provinces, and appointed loyal governors to oversee far-flung territories. His policies brought wealth and stability, but also increased the burden on subject peoples, whose resentment simmered beneath the surface. In Tenochtitlan, Montezuma oversaw projects that reflected both his piety and his taste for grandeur. The Templo Mayor was enriched with new offerings, its shrines gleamed with gold, turquoise, and precious feathers. Palaces were expanded, gardens filled with rare plants and animals from across the empire. Scholars and priests enjoyed royal patronage, copying codices, observing the heavens, and refining the rituals that tied the Mexica to their gods. Yet as the empire grew more magnificent, Montezuma's reliance on omens and prophecies deepened. He paid close attention to the pronouncements of seers and the readings of the sacred calendar. In the years leading up to the arrival of the Spaniards, a series of strange events unsettled the court and the people alike: a temple struck by lightning without rain, mysterious flames in the night sky, the sudden boiling of Lake Texcoco's waters, and the appearance of strange, deformed creatures. These were interpreted by many as warnings from the gods, though their meaning was debated. It was in this atmosphere of both confidence and unease that word reached Montezuma of unknown men landing on the coast, men with pale skin, beards, and strange weapons. At first, the reports were treated as curiosities, but as messengers brought more detailed accounts, the emperor's concern grew. Some within his court whispered that these newcomers might be connected to ancient prophecies, perhaps even the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, who, according to legend, had departed to the east and would one day return. Montezuma's response was cautious. He sent emissaries bearing gifts, gold, fine cloaks, and food, perhaps to learn the strangers' intentions, perhaps to encourage them to leave without conflict. But the gifts only fueled the newcomers' interest. Their leader, a man named Hernan Cortés, began marching inland, gathering allies among the empire's enemies. As the Spaniards advanced, Montezuma faced a dilemma no Mexico ruler before him had known: how to deal with an enemy whose weapons, animals, and tactics were utterly foreign. His hesitation, born of both strategic calculation and religious uncertainty, would shape the fate of the empire. In the great city of Tenochtitlan, life continued as before, the markets crowded, the temples filled with incense and song, yet beneath the surface, a sense of foreboding grew. The ruler who had inherited the empire at the height of its power now stood at the edge of an unknown storm. Beyond the lakes and mountains, forces unlike any in the Mexico world were drawing closer, their sails white against the horizon, their purpose hidden but their impact inevitable. Soon, the balance that had sustained the empire for generations would be tested in ways the Mexica could scarcely imagine, and the man who sat upon the reed mat and throne of Tenochtitlan would find himself at the center of a drama that would change the course of history forever. In the year 1519, the calm rhythm of life in the Valley of Mexico was broken by news from the east. Messengers came swiftly, their breath short from the long journey, bringing tales of strangers who had landed on the coast. They spoke of men with skin pale as bone and hair upon their faces, of animals taller than any deer and swifter than the wind, of weapons that roared like thunder and tore through warriors' shields as if they were reeds. The strangers had come in floating mountains, their sails like giant white wings. They had stepped onto the shore at a place called Sempoala, bringing with them not only strange goods but an aura of power and mystery. Their leader, Hernan Cortés, wasted no time in making allies. He sought out the Totonacs, a people long burdened by Mexica tribute, and promised them freedom in exchange for their support. This was a language they understood, and they joined him. From the coast, Cortés moved inland toward the powerful city of Tlaxcala, one of the few polities that had resisted Mexican conquest. Fierce battles erupted, but when neither side could gain a decisive victory, diplomacy replaced war. The Tlaxcalans, recognizing in Cortés a potential weapon against their old enemy, entered into alliance with him. With each step, the Spaniards' small force grew in numbers and confidence. In Tenochtitlan, Montezuma received these reports with growing unease. The omens of past years now seemed to converge upon this moment. Were these strangers mere men, or were they the agents, perhaps even the embodiment of divine will? Montezuma's decision was to meet this potential threat with caution. He sent gifts to Cortés, gold discs, feathered cloaks, and precious stones. These offerings, meant to awe and perhaps dissuade, instead fueled the Spaniards' hunger. They saw in gold not the sacred beauty the Mexica revered, but the promise of wealth beyond imagining. The journey from the coast to the valley was long and arduous. The Spaniards and their allies crossed mountains, passed smoking volcanoes, and descended into highland basins where the air was thin and clear. As they approached, they caught their first glimpse of the valley, shimmering lakes, fertile fields, and in the center, the gleaming city of Tenochtitlan rising from the water like a vision. Cortés understood the power of spectacle as well as Montezuma. He entered the city not as a raider, but as a guest. The causeways leading into Tenochtitlan were lined with citizens curious to see these men and their towering beasts. The city's beauty astonished the Spaniards: broad streets and canals, markets overflowing with goods, temples rising like mountains, gardens lush with flowers. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortez's companions, later wrote that no city in Europe could compare. Montezuma greeted Cortez with courtesy, offering him a place in his palace and gifts of food and finery. The meeting between the two men was marked by formality, each aware of the other's power, each weighing the meaning of their encounter. For several days, Cortez and his men were treated as honored guests. Yet beneath the hospitality ran an undercurrent of tension. The Spaniards, curious and ambitious, explored the city, noting its defenses and its wealth. The Mexica, in turn, watched their every move. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that diplomacy might prevail. But the nature of the Spaniards' ambitions and the delicate balance of power in the valley made such peace fragile. The alliance Cortez had forged with Tlaxcala, the presence of his strange weapons, and the greed that his men scarcely concealed all hinted at a future in which Tenochtitlan would be more than a stop on their journey. It would be a prize. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between guest and host would transform into one of captor and captive. The meeting of the old world and the new, which had begun informal greetings and mutual wonder, was already moving toward betrayal, bloodshed, and the unraveling of an empire that had believed itself destined to endure forever. The first days of Cortez's stay in Tenochtitlan were filled with formal exchanges, feasts, and the careful observation of two cultures meeting across a gulf of language and understanding. Yet beneath the courtesy, both sides moved according to strategies shaped by suspicion and ambition. Cortez knew that his small force could not hold the city by sheer strength; he needed leverage. Montezuma, aware of the Spaniards' alliances with his enemies and the awe their weapons inspired, sought to contain them through hospitality and ritual. But the balance shifted when Cortez made his boldest move. Claiming that his safety was at risk from Mexica factions hostile to the newcomers, he persuaded, or coerced, Montezuma into leaving his palace and taking residence under Spanish guard. The official story, told later by the Spaniards, was that the emperor agreed willingly, trusting in friendship. The reality was more complex. Whether through persuasion, threat, or the weight of omens, Montezuma found himself a ruler in name only, his movements watched, his decisions subject to foreign approval. At first, the city remained calm. Montezuma's presence and word still carried weight, and the Spaniards treated him with outward respect. But as days turned into weeks, the reality of his captivity became impossible to ignore. Orders from the palace now bore the mark of Spanish influence, and Mexican nobles began to question whether their Tlatoani still acted in the interest of the gods and the people, or in the interest of the strangers. Cortez, meanwhile, sought to solidify his position. He ordered the destruction of idols in certain temples and replaced them with Christian crosses and images of the Virgin Mary. To the Mexica, this was not merely an insult but a direct assault on the foundations of their world. Tensions in the city began to rise. While Cortez maneuvered in Tenochtitlan, a new danger appeared on the coast, a Spanish expedition sent from Cuba to arrest him for exceeding his authority. Leaving a garrison in the city under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, Cortez marched east to confront this rival force. In his absence, the fragile peace shattered. During the festival of Toxcatl, when the Mexica gathered in the sacred precinct to honor the god Tezcatlipoca, Alvarado, fearing an uprising, or seeking to preempt one, ordered his men to attack the unarmed celebrants. Warriors, nobles, and priests were cut down in the temple courtyard, their blood staining the stones. The massacre ignited the city. When Cortés returned, victorious over the rival Spanish force, he found Tenochtitlan in open revolt. The Spaniards, now besieged in the palace, turned to Montezuma to calm his people. According to Spanish accounts, the emperor addressed the crowd from a balcony, urging them to cease the fighting. Stones and darts flew in response. One struck Montezuma, inflicting wounds that would prove fatal. Whether he was killed by his own people in fury or died later from his injuries under Spanish custody remains uncertain, but his death marked the collapse of the authority that had held the city together. With Montezuma gone, the Spaniards faced an enraged populace united in purpose. The city's causeways became battlefields, every street a trap. The alliance between host and guest was broken beyond repair, and the Spaniards now fought not for influence, but for survival. The empire, long held together by the divine aura of its ruler, had entered a new and chaotic chapter, one in which the gods themselves seemed to have turned their faces away. The death of Montezuma left a void that could not remain empty for long. In the chaos that followed, the Mexican nobles chose Cuitlahuac, Montezuma's brother, as the new Huitlahuac. A seasoned warrior and respected leader, Cuitlahuac wasted no time in rallying the city's defenders. His reign would be short, measured in weeks rather than years, but in that time he would lead one of the most determined resistances in the history of the empire. The Spaniards, now trapped within Tenochtitlan, found themselves besieged. Every street, every canal, every rooftop became a battleground. Canoes filled with warriors harried them from the water, while others attacked from the causeways and narrow alleys. Supplies ran low, morale faltered, and the air inside their quarters grew heavy with the smell of blood, sweat, and fear. Realizing that their position was untenable, Cortés decided to attempt a retreat under the cover of night. Laden with gold and precious goods taken from the city, the Spaniards and their native allies tried to cross the causeways to the mainland. But the Mexica were watching. As the fugitives moved across the darkened waters, canoes swarmed around them, and warriors attacked from both sides. The weight of the treasure, greedily carried by many, dragged them down when they fell into the lake. Hundreds perished in the chaos. The survivors would remember it as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Cuitlahuac's victory was decisive, but fate dealt him a cruel blow. In the weeks following the Spaniards' flight, smallpox swept through Tenochtitlan. Introduced by the invaders' allies, the disease spread rapidly among a population with no immunity. It killed thousands, including Cuitlahuac himself. The loss was devastating, coming at a moment when unity and strong leadership were most needed. In the wake of his death, the nobles turned to Cuauhtémoc, a young but already renowned warrior, to lead the defense of the city. Barely in his 20s, Cuauhtémoc embodied the courage and resolve of the Mexica. Under his command, preparations for the inevitable return of the Spaniards began in earnest. Causeways were fortified, bridges removed, and the city's warriors readied for a fight to the death. Cortés, meanwhile, regrouped in Tlaxcala. He rebuilt his forces, forged new alliances, and constructed brigantines, small warships designed to control the waters of Lake Texcoco. In 1521, he returned, this time with a larger army and the clear intention of destroying Tenochtitlan once and for all. The siege that followed was relentless. For nearly 3 months, the city endured assaults from land and water. The brigantines cut off supplies and prevented the Mexica from moving freely across the lake. The Spaniards and their allies advanced along the causeways, tearing down buildings and filling canals to deny defenders the advantage of their watery home. Inside the city, hunger and disease took a terrible toll. Still, Cuauhtémoc and his warriors fought with unyielding ferocity, launching counterattacks, setting ambushes, and refusing every offer to surrender. Day by day, the city was reduced to rubble. The once bustling markets lay in ruins, temples burned, and the canals clogged with debris and bodies. By August, the Mexica could fight no more. On the 13th of that month, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to flee across the lake. Brought before Cortés, he is said to have declared, "I have done what I could to defend my city. Now take my life." Cortés spared him for the moment, but the empire he had fought to save was gone. The fall of Tenochtitlan was more than the loss of a city, it was the end of an era. The heart of the Mexico world had been torn out, its temples leveled, its people enslaved or scattered. Yet even in defeat, the courage of Cuauhtémoc and the defenders remained a symbol of resistance, a final stand against forces that had swept across the ocean to change the fate of an entire continent. When the smoke cleared over Tenochtitlan, the city that had once been the jewel of the Valley of Mexico lay in ruins. Its temples, once bright with banners and alive with the chants of priests, were toppled into heaps of broken stone. The canals that had glistened in the sun were choked with rubble and corpses. The scent of flowers and incense had been replaced by the stench of smoke, blood, and decay. For the survivors, the end had come not with a single blow, but with the slow and grinding collapse of everything they had known. The siege had starved the city, stripping away its strength long before the final assault. Disease, brought by the invaders, had claimed thousands more. Now, with their warriors fallen and their ruler Cuauhtémoc in chains, the Mexica faced a future in which the gods of their ancestors no longer ruled and the empire they had built over generations was gone. The Spaniards moved quickly to secure their victory. The sacred precinct, heart of the city's spiritual life, was dismantled stone by stone. On its ruins they began to erect churches, symbols of the new order. Idols were smashed, altars torn down, codices burned in the plazas. In their place came the cross, the mass, and the Spanish crown's authority. To the conquerors, this was the triumph of their faith and king; to the conquered, it was the erasure of their world. The people of Tenochtitlan, those who had survived hunger, battle, and disease, were forced into the labor of building the new city of Mexico on the ruins of the old. The grandeur of their palaces and temples was replaced by European-style stone buildings, their materials taken from the sacred structures of the Mexica. Streets were laid out in a grid, and the waterways that had once defined the city's life were gradually filled in. Cuauhtémoc, the young ruler who had fought until the last, remained a prisoner. For a time, he was treated with a measure of respect, perhaps for his bravery in battle. But as Cortés pushed further into other regions in search of more wealth, he took Cuauhtémoc along as a hostage to ensure the cooperation of the conquered Mexica. In 1525, during an expedition to Honduras, Cortés accused him of plotting rebellion. Without trial, the last Huey Tlatoani was executed, ending the royal line of the empire. The destruction of Tenochtitlan sent shockwaves through the lands it had ruled. Tributary states, once bound together under Mexican authority, now faced a new and unfamiliar master. Some saw an opportunity in the fall of the empire, hoping for relief from tribute demands. Others, especially those who had been loyal to the Mexica, found themselves crushed beneath Spanish rule just as firmly as they had been under the Triple Alliance. Yet even as the physical structures of the empire crumbled, its memory endured. The songs, poems, and oral histories carried by survivors preserved the story of the Mexica's rise and fall. In whispered words and secret rituals, the names of Huitzilopochtli, Tlaloc, and Quetzalcoatl were still spoken. The eagle and cactus remain potent symbols, reminders of the prophecy that had brought their ancestors to the lake. For the Spaniards, the conquest of the Mexica was the opening chapter in a new colonial order that would stretch across the continent. For the people of Tenochtitlan, it was the closing of a cosmic cycle, the end of an age when the sun rose each day on a world shaped by their gods and their warriors. The stones of their city might be carried away to build another, but the memory of what had been could not be so easily erased. In the years following the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Valley of Mexico became the heart of a new colonial world. The Spaniards called it Nueva España, New Spain, and from its center, they extended their authority over lands far beyond the reach of the former Mexica Empire. Yet for the people who had lived under the Triple Alliance, life under the new order was not liberation, it was transformation under the weight of foreign rule. The rebuilding of the city began almost immediately. The Spaniards used the ruins of Tenochtitlan as a quarry, repurposing the carved stones of temples and palaces to construct churches, government buildings, and the homes of Spanish settlers. The sacred precinct became the site of a vast cathedral, its towers rising where the Templo Mayor had once stood. The great causeways were repaired for the movement of carts and horses, and canals were filled to make way for streets more suited to European designs. Slowly, the watery heart of the Mexica capital was replaced with dry land. The population of the city changed as well. Survivors of the siege, weakened by hunger and disease, were forced into labor, working under the encomienda system. In this arrangement, Spanish colonists were granted the right to the labor and tribute of the native population in return for promises of protection and religious instruction. In practice, it was a system of exploitation. Men toiled in fields, workshops, and mines, women worked in households or produced textiles, and all were subject to demands for tribute in goods and labor. Religion was at the forefront of the Spaniards' efforts to reshape the conquered people. Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian friars arrived in great numbers, determined to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. Temples were destroyed or repurposed as churches, idols were smashed, and sacred rituals were outlawed. Yet the missionaries also learned native languages, compiled dictionaries, and preserved certain aspects of the culture, often reframing them within Christian narratives. Baptism was widespread, sometimes voluntary, often compelled. Festivals honoring the saints replaced those dedicated to the old gods, though in many villages, the dances, songs, and offerings retained echoes of their pre-Hispanic origins. Economic life shifted under Spanish control. The tribute system continued, but its benefits no longer flowed to the Mexican nobility or their allies. Instead, they enriched Spanish officials, soldiers, and settlers. European goods, iron tools, glass beads, and cloth entered the markets, alongside indigenous products like maize, cacao, and cochineal dye. New crops and animals arrived from across the sea: wheat, cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. These altered the landscape and the diet of the people, sometimes enriching it, sometimes displacing native foods and farming methods. Society itself was reordered along lines unfamiliar to the Mexica. A caste system emerged, placing Spaniards born in Europe, peninsulas, at the top, followed by Spaniards born in the Americas, criollos, then mixed-race peoples, mestizos, and finally the indigenous population, who bore the heaviest burdens. Within this framework, the former Mexican nobility retained certain privileges, such as the right to hold local office, but their authority was now subordinate to Spanish governors and judges. Despite the hardships, elements of the old culture endured. The Nahuatl language remained widely spoken, serving as a bridge between different indigenous groups and even between natives and Spaniards. Traditional crafts continued in adapted forms, with artisans producing goods for colonial markets. In rural areas, old religious practices persisted in hidden or disguised forms, merged with Catholic rituals into a syncretic faith that the authorities could not fully suppress. Life under Spanish rule was a mixture of loss, adaptation, and survival. The great ceremonies of the Templo Mayor were gone, replaced by the bells of churches and the processions of saints. The warrior's honor had no place in the new order, yet stories of the battles against Cortés were told in quiet moments, passing from elders to children. The Mexica Empire had fallen, but its people, now subjects of a distant king, continued to live, work, and remember. And in that memory lay the seeds of an identity that would outlast both the empire they had built and the colonial order that had replaced it. Though the empire of the Mexica had been broken and its temples reduced to rubble, the memory of its greatness did not vanish with the fall of Tenochtitlan. Among the survivors, the past lived on in the stories told by elders, in the songs still sung in the quiet of the night, and in the rituals that continued behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of the Spaniards. What had been an empire now became a legacy, carried in the words, symbols, and collective memory of its people. The conquerors brought their own chroniclers, priests, soldiers, and officials, who wrote about the Mexica in their own languages, often through the filter of European assumptions. Yet they also relied on indigenous scribes, who recorded the history, customs, and beliefs of their people in the Nahuatl language, using the Latin alphabet the Spaniards had introduced. Many of these scribes were members of the former Mexican nobility, educated in both the old traditions and the new order, serving as cultural bridges between worlds. Their works preserved not only the story of the conquest but also the deeper history of the Mexica, the migration from Aztlan, the founding of Tenochtitlan, the reigns of great rulers, and the rituals that sustained the cosmos. In villages and towns, the codices, Pictorial manuscripts once used to record tribute, genealogy, and sacred narratives, took on new forms. Some were destroyed by zealous missionaries who saw them as tools of idolatry. Others were hidden, buried, or disguised as Christian works. A few were commissioned by colonial authorities to document land claims or the rights of indigenous communities, inadvertently preserving fragments of the Mexica worldview. Oral tradition remained the most enduring vessel of memory. The deeds of legendary warriors, the beauty of the markets of Tlatelolco, the terrifying splendor of the Templo Maya during the great festivals, all were kept alive in poems and songs. The cuicatl, or sacred song, retained its power even when stripped of its ritual setting, speaking of loss, honor, and the transience of life. These performances were acts of quiet resistance, affirmations that the past could not be erased by decree. Religious syncretism also became a repository of memory. In the figure of the Virgin of Guadalupe, many saw echoes of Tonantzin, the revered mother goddess. Pilgrimages to her shrine at Tepeyac blended Catholic devotion with indigenous reverence for sacred landscapes. The dances performed during saints' festivals often retained the steps, rhythms, and costumes of pre-Hispanic ceremonies, their original meanings hidden in plain sight. For the descendants of the Mexica, the fall of their empire became both a wound and a point of identity. To remember was to honor the sacrifices of their ancestors, to forget would be to lose themselves entirely. In the colonial courts, former noble families invoked their lineage to claim certain rights, framing themselves as guardians of a heritage that predated the arrival of the Spaniards by centuries. Even among the Spaniards and their descendants, the image of the Aztecs, as they came to be called, took on a kind of fascination. European readers marveled at accounts of the vast city on the lake, its markets and temples, its warriors in jaguar and eagle regalia. The very empire they had destroyed became, in their writings, a symbol of grandeur and tragedy. Over the centuries, as colonial rule deepened, the living memory of the Mexica would blend with legend, myth, and the interpretations of those who wrote their history. Yet the heart of that memory, the vision of an eagle on a cactus, the courage of warriors defending their city, the deep bond between the people and their gods, would endure, passing quietly from one generation to the next. In the songs, in the stories, and in the symbols carved into stone and painted in color, the Mexica lived on, not as they had been, but as they were remembered. Centuries after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the prophecy that had once guided the Mexica from their distant homeland of Aztlan still resonated in the heart of Mexico. The image of the eagle perched upon a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent, the sign that had led the Mexica to their island in Lake Texcoco, endured as more than a memory. It became a symbol of resilience, rebirth, and the enduring spirit of a people who had seen their world destroyed and yet refused to vanish. During the long centuries of Spanish rule, the Mexica legacy survived in the rhythms of everyday life. Nahuatl words remained woven into the language of the land, spoken alongside Spanish in markets, homes, and fields. The taste of maize tortillas, the color of woven textiles, the designs of pottery and jewelry, all bore the imprint of the Mexica and their ancestors. Their agricultural practices, especially the ingenious Chinampa system, continued to feed communities around the Valley of Mexico long after the canals of Tenochtitlan had been filled in. In the 19th century, When Mexico fought for and achieved independence from Spain, leaders of the new nation sought symbols that could unite its diverse peoples. They found one in the Old Mexica prophecy. The eagle, the cactus, and the serpent were placed at the center of the national flag, not as a relic of a fallen empire, but as a declaration that the strength and vision of the Mexica still flowed in the veins of the modern nation. What had once been a divine omen became a national emblem, flown above government buildings, schools, and battlefields. The ruins of Tenochtitlan, long buried beneath the streets of Mexico City, slowly emerged through the work of archaeologists in the 20th century. The rediscovery of the Templo Maya, its carved stones still bearing the images of gods and warriors, brought the Mexica once more into the public imagination. Museums displayed their art, their tools, and the codices that had survived conquest and time. Scholars and storytellers re-examined their history, moving beyond the accounts written by the conquerors to hear the voices of the Mexica themselves. In modern Mexico, festivals, dances, and ceremonies often draw on Mexica traditions, whether in pure form or blended with later influences. Young people learn Nahuatl songs and ancient dances, not as curiosities, but as living links to their heritage. Across the city and countryside, murals depict scenes of Mexica history, the founding of Tenochtitlan, the grandeur of its markets, the final stand against the Spaniards. These images are not only reminders of the past, but also affirmations of cultural survival. The Mexica story has also become a global one. Visitors from around the world come to stand among the ruins in the heart of Mexico City, imagining the causeways and canals, the crowded markets, the towering temples. Historians, artists, and poets return again and again to the story of a people who, guided by their gods and driven by their will, built one of the most remarkable cities in the world, and whose spirit endures even after its destruction. The eagle and cactus, once a vision in the marshes of Lake Texcoco, now soar on flags, monuments, and the hearts of millions. In them is the echo of the Mexica's journey, the memory of their rise and fall, and the enduring truth that even in the face of conquest, a people's identity can survive. The Mexica are gone as rulers of an empire, but they remain as ancestors, as inspiration, and as a reminder that the past is never truly lost. It lives on in the symbols we carry, the stories we tell, and the land that still remembers their footsteps.